Clean, even edges all the way around. That's what a quilt needs before you can sew on the binding. But squaring up and trimming can sometimes be a little tricky. So let's walk through the process together. We'll look at three quilts. One I made that was quilted by Darla Parks on her longarm quilting machine. One I quilted on my domestic or home sewing machine. And one quilted with a walking foot and decorative stitch. I'm showing different sizes because the method I use depends partly on the size of the quilt. We'll also compare some tool options from the quilt store with a tool option from the home improvement store. Why does this step matter so much? It matters because every single quilt, no matter how it was quilted, needs to have the excess batting and backing trimmed away before you can sew on the binding. And how you trim it off can be the difference between ending up with a quilt that lies nice and flat with straight sides and square corners versus a quilt with uneven edges, wavy edges, or wonky corners. A quick side note, a wonky quilt isn't inherently bad, but it may not be what you're going for. Here's the thing, quilts are textiles, and textiles can scooch and stretch even if you've done everything right. But the good news is that if you've basted carefully, and I use either safety pins or basting spray, the shifting should be minimal. We're basically just tidying everything up so that sewing on the binding will be easy peasy. Let's start with the quilting tools. I'll be using the OmniGrid 12.5-inch ruler that I've had for years and years, and my newer Creative Grids 6.5-inch wide by 24.5-inch non-slip ruler, but you can use whatever brand of rulers you have. And after I take you through the process with the rulers, I'll also share a popular option from the home improvement store. Let's start with this walking foot practice piece I pulled out of storage. What I want you to see is how the fabric has stretched a little bit around the outer edges with the decorative stitch quilting. This is really not a big deal, but it definitely calls for neatening up. The nice thing about a piece like this is that my ruler reaches all the way across, so trimming is easy. If we look at the trimmings, we can see where the stretched out uneven edge was. It's all trimmed up and tidy now. Let's pause here for a quick tip. Depending on how your quilt was quilted, you may find yourself cutting across quilting lines and leaving unsecured threads along the outer edges of your quilt. No worries. The binding will secure those threads and keep the stitches from slipping out. But for extra security, I like to stay stitch inside the seam allowance along the outer edge of the quilt with a longer basting stitch. And what I mean is, if you normally sew with a stitch length of 2, try 3.5. Or if you normally sew with a stitch length of 2.5, try 4. This stitching will also help flatten the edge and keep everything in alignment when we're sewing on the binding. Okay, let's move on to the baby quilt. We'll use both rulers for this one. I like to start on the bottom right-hand corner of my quilt, but any corner will do. The square ruler comes first, as that will help us get that perfectly neat 90-degree corner. Keep the blade right next to the ruler as you cut, and try for a nice, smooth motion, always cutting away from yourself. Next, I'll switch to a long ruler to do the sides. But how are we going to make sure the alignment of our ruler stays nice and straight when the batting and backing fabric is covering up the lines on the mat? It might be tempting to just use the outer edge of the quilt itself, but that's generally not going to be as accurate. Remember that stretching and scooching that I mentioned? It's usually more accurate to line up one of the vertical lines in the ruler with an internal vertical seam in the quilt. Here I have the 2-inch line on my ruler lined up with the border seam. An alternative method is to bring back our square ruler, line it up with the lines on our cutting mat, and use it as a guide to line up the long ruler. Either way, work in sections. Don't try to reach all the way across the quilt unless it is very small. And walk your hand up the ruler so it doesn't pivot. When we get to the next corner, we'll temporarily switch back to the square ruler and so on. Here's a peek at the fully trimmed quilt ready to be bound. We can double check to make sure everything is great by folding opposite ends of the trimmed quilt inward to meet each other, comparing side to side, and then the upper edge of the quilt to the bottom edge. If the quilt is shaped like a square or a rectangle, the opposite edges of the quilt should closely match. Okay, now let's go bigger. It's pretty common to lay large quilts out on the floor for trimming, as that's the easiest way to make sure the quilt is completely smooth and flat. That's what I used to do too, but now my knees are giving that a hard pass. Back when I was doing this on the floor, I used a 24-inch by 36-inch cutting mat like this. And yes, it's possible to use a smaller mat, but bigger is going to be easier. I moved the cutting mat around the outer edge of the quilt as I cut. But much as I love you guys, I'm not going to demo this next step by crawling around on the floor. Instead, I'm going to demo on my table and pretend that the white gridded mat is actually the floor. I'll be doing all my cutting on the green mat, shifting it as needed, just like I would if I actually was on the floor. And just like before, I'm going to use my square ruler to start trimming at the corner of the quilt. Here's my first cut. As I do this, I want to point out two things. One is that this old ruler is a little slippy, and the other is that I walked my hand up the ruler to help keep my hand parallel to the cutter as I cut. Next step, I've trimmed the other side of the corner. For this quilt, I'm barely trimming anything at all, less than 1/8 of an inch at most, and sometimes just stray thread ends. But remember that slippy ruler? Here's a quick old school trick. A couple of long loops of painter's tape on the underside of the ruler. It may be a bit of a pain, but I haven't been able to upgrade all of my rulers to non-slip versions yet. Here we go. Here's the first piece. Now we need one more. Okay, here it comes. All right, and get the loop. That's what I get for trying to rush. It's coming apart. Oh well, it's still gonna work. All right, here's my second piece. And the tape will hold the ruler securely in place even if I move the quilt itself. See how stable that is? But it's still going to be easy to lift the ruler up and away without leaving any sticky residue on the quilt when I'm done. So, easy peasy. Now I'm ready to start working my way up the side of the quilt. One option is to use the second ruler method. I'm using the square ruler here to help keep my long ruler nice and straight. But remember that tile and flooring tool I showed you earlier? In case you're interested, I'm including a link in the description to the exact model that I'm using. Let's bring it out to play and see if it's something you'd like to try. I've turned down the light in the room so that it's easier to see the bright red laser beam. Because the tool was sitting partly on the batting and backing and partly directly on the mat, I tucked a scrap underneath to help stabilize it and keep it level. You can see that it's not quite there yet in the photo. I'm working my way around the quilt, lining up the ruler with the laser line, working towards the tool, which is at the top of the photo. It might be hard to see in the photo because the laser line is so close in color to my quilt, but it shows up really well in person. Here's the question. Is the tool worth the expense? When I checked the prices this week, tools like this were running $20 to $40 US. For me, it depends on the size of the quilt. Personally, I never bother pulling it out for anything smaller than a large throw or bed-sized quilt. But for very large quilts, especially a queen or a king, it sure can come in handy. So while it's not a must-have for me, it is fun to have. And some folks love it. So it's all about finding the tools that work best for you. Here comes another quick tip. If you're wrangling a large quilt, you may find it helpful to fold the quilt so that the weight of the quilt that's hanging down doesn't pull it off the table. It can also help to use some heavy books or even canned food. I'm using canned beans here to help hold the quilt in place while you're cutting. In the end, it all comes down to whatever method works best for you, even if it ends up being a little different from what I've demonstrated today. Whatever method you choose, here's a quick checklist because it's always better to catch something before sewing on the binding rather than after. Nothing flipped, scrunched, bunched, or caught in the stitches along the outer edge of the quilt. Corners for a square or rectangular quilt are all cut accurately. And opposite edges of the quilt match in length, if they're supposed to. What method do you prefer? Tell me in the comments. Mats and rulers or a laser square? I make videos specifically for quilters who want to understand the why behind the recommendations. If that sounds like your kind of quilting education, please consider subscribing and joining my email list so that you don't miss a single video. And if you're ready to bind your quilt, I have a whole playlist of options for you. Happy quilting and trimming!